One of the things you learn about communications very early is just how absolutely crucial it is to get the right message to the right audience at the right time, when they're most receptive, when you've got the right content and they're ready really to kind of take some action. And I was reminded just how crucial that is a few months ago, fortunate enough to move into a new office building in the Kansas City area. There was a delivery, and it was a floral delivery, and somebody said it's a really nice plant. And I thought, well, that's really nice. You know, somebody recognized we're moving to kind of brighten the new office up a little bit. So I opened the card and it said, "With our deepest sympathies." And I thought, well, that's kind of strange. I've got some strange friends, but nobody quite that strange that I know. So I called the florist, at least I didn't think so. So I called the florist and I said, you know, I'm not sure this was actually supposed to come to us. And he said, don't worry about it, I'll check into it and I'll call you right back. So we continued to unpack boxes and get things set up in the office. And he called back a little while later and he said, gosh, I'm terribly sorry. He said, that was not supposed to come to you, but we do have one for you. We'll bring it right over. And I said, not to worry. I said, I have a small business, understand how things like that can happen. He said, actually, it's a wee bit more serious than that. He said, your display actually went to the funeral home with a card that said, congratulations on your new location. So it's crucially important to get the right message to the right audience at the right time. And we're going to see if we can make that happen this morning. Most people involved in agriculture, particularly those involved at the point of production, farmers and others who are working the land, working with animals, producing food for people all around the world, are primarily interested in protecting their freedom to operate. How do you do what you do best with a minimum amount of outside interference? Because you chose to go into agriculture and farming because you have a passion for agriculture, you have a passion for animals, you have a passion for the land, not because you wanted to get into public relations, issues management, or politics. You'd have chosen a different career if that were the case. So what I'm hoping that we're able to do this morning is to build a model that will end with helping to protect your freedom to operate. But it's going to look a little different than some of the historical strategies that we've used. Just a bit more about my background. I spent 10 years as Vice President of Communications for the largest swine integrator in the States. At that time, we were the first ones to take on financing from Wall Street, and when we were growing, we were building a barn and a quarter a day. So we were growing very, very rapidly. And we were not all that beloved by the communities in which we were growing. People were concerned about what we were doing to the environment, the size and structure of agriculture. And so we relied on two primary strategies to protect our interest. We knew we were going to have really good science, and we were going to attack everyone who attacked us. Those were going to be the two strategies we were going to use to protect our interest. And what we saw over time was that those strategies no longer work. That's not an effective strategy in today's environment to protect your freedom to operate. So we're going to spend a little time talking about why those are no longer effective, and then more importantly, what is? What can we begin to do now to really help protect that freedom to operate? Because in today's environment, it requires you to consistently earn and maintain what we refer to as a social license. And we define that as the privilege of operating with minimal formalized restrictions based on maintaining public trust by doing what's right. And those restrictions can be imposed by legislation, by regulation, or more frequently today and more quickly through the market, where a company, a branded food company, a branded retailer can say, you know, I'm not comfortable with mulesing. We're not going to buy merino wool any longer. I'm not comfortable with how you're raising those animals. I'm not going to buy your lamb any longer. And in that instance, there's no promulgation process, there's no public hearing, there's no opportunity for you to engage unless you've engaged much, much earlier in that process. And public trust is a belief that your activities are consistent with social expectations, the values of the community, and other stakeholders. So what do people think about what you do, and is what you do consistent with their values? And I think I can make a fairly compelling case for doing the right thing as being the best thing for your business. Because at the end of the day, if these decisions don't add to the bottom line and don't protect your freedom to operate, you really shouldn't engage in them. But I was very impressed with Jason's presentation yesterday, and a lot of the points that he made, I think, will dovetail into what I'm talking about this morning. You'll notice there on the left-hand side of the screen that we're talking about social license. And you're granted the social license to kind of operate with minimal formalized restrictions when the perception is that your practices are consistent with the ethics, the values, and the expectations of your stakeholders. So if they believe you're kind of committed to doing what's right, they won't feel the need to impose more social control. That gives you the opportunity to have more flexible systems, more responsive systems, and therefore lower cost systems. I'll give you another illustration from my experience in the pork industry. At that farm where we worked, we had a series of relatively high-profile manure spills. And the state of Missouri came in and they said, I'm sorry, but you have violated the public trust for how you manage the waste from your livestock. So we're going to take away your social license and we're going to replace it with social control in the form of more stringent regulatory requirements for manure management. And we knew from our benchmarking service that our cost of environmental compliance was now 6 times our industry competitors. So we made ourselves significantly less competitive because we lost that social license and we saw greater social control. So there's significant economic value in maintaining the social license. The other thing we typically take for granted in agriculture that we don't understand quite as well is that that social license applies to the entire category. It applies to the group. Historically, we've kind of assumed that the negative consequences for a bad actor will accrue only to the bad actor. Not the case. If somebody decides, if a branded food company decides to stop buying wool because of mulesing, it doesn't only impact the farm that was captured on video. It impacts everybody in the sector. The same thing happened in our situation in Missouri. The state of Missouri didn't say, we're going to pass regulations for your company. They said, we're going to pass regulations for everybody in this category. That means you have a collective interest in the activities of every single farmer, because your social license is dependent upon how your neighbor operates his farm. That's a different way for us to think about how we operate in agriculture. How do we create that culture that respects the independence that has become the foundation and backbone of who we are and what we do, but still recognizes the need for us to collectively work together to maintain that level of public trust to protect your social license? And you've seen that clearly be threatened when we've had the mulesing incident, where activists have said, you know, this is a practice that we think is a violation of the public trust. We think it's inconsistent with the values and the expectations of stakeholders. We think it should go away. So they work hard to make that a tipping point so there's more social control, and they use the marketplace to drive that social control. And you've clearly seen the results of that, where fashion chains threaten Australian wool boycott. You've seen several brands that have stepped into that space, and you can anticipate more of this over time. And we'll talk about the dynamic relationship between activist organizations or NGOs and your production practices more a little bit later in the presentation. But when you start to see high-profile brands associated with your products, their primary job is to protect the value of that brand, not to protect your ability to do what you do on your farm. So how can we do a better job of working with them to understand that those practices are in the animal's best interest? Not in your best interest, but in the best interest of the animals. So social license, as I mentioned before, is based on maintaining public trust. And historically, I've spent a lot of time trying to work on agriculture's image. And we had a stakeholder engagement process a few years ago where we had people from across the entire food chain in the room having a conversation about these issues. And it was a person responsible for social responsibility for one of the world's largest quick service chains who said, you know, you've got it all wrong. Agriculture, you think you've got a problem with your image. It's not a problem with image, it's a problem of trust. People aren't sure they should trust agriculture anymore. And trust and image are two very different concepts. And so we took that to heart and we began to do some research on what does it take to build trust as opposed to change our image, because they take you in two very, very different directions strategically. If you're focused on polishing your image, you engage in one kind of activities. If you talk about building trust, it's an entirely different kind of activity. So we partnered with Steve Sapp at Iowa State University, and we looked at 21 different pieces of research on the question of trust in food. And in each of those, we found 3 common drivers that you'll see there on the left-hand side of the screen. The first one at the bottom of the screen is influential others. That includes your family and friends and credentialed individuals whose opinions you respect. Could be a dietitian, could be a doctor, could be a veterinarian, could be a nutritionist, could be a lawyer. No, probably not a lawyer. Then the second element in building trust is competence. That's our technical capacity, our skills, and our science. And historically, that's where we've spent most of the time talking about who we are and what we do in agriculture, right? We have good science, and we need good science because you work in very narrow margin businesses where you have to continue to improve to remain competitive in a global market. The third element in building trust is confidence, or the perception of shared values and ethics. In other words, can I count on you to do what's right? So we surveyed 6,000 U.S. consumers over the course of 3 years on food safety and nutrition and animal care and on-farm sustainability and a wide range of issues related to farming and agriculture. And what we discovered was really interesting. What we found was that the perception of shared values and ethics is 3 to 5 times more important than demonstrating our competency in building trust. So we've had the communication equation exactly backward. We've assumed that people will be rational, that they will be data-driven, and if we can simply give them enough information, they will come to our side of the argument and begin to support who we are and what we do, which is why historically we've tried to educate the public. Because clearly, if we simply give people enough data, they will come to our side because the data proves that we can do what we're doing. So we'll talk about a different approach and why that approach, we don't discard it because we have to stay ingrained in science. It's crucial to what we do, but it can no longer play the lead role in our communication and outreach. What does it mean? It's the old quote from former U.S. President Roosevelt, they don't really care how much you know until they know how much you care. And the challenge we have today is because of the geographical and generational disconnect that we have between the public and farmers, they're not sure you care anymore. If we're not out there helping them understand our commitment to doing what's right, they're no longer confident that we care the way we should. So we end up with these polarizing perceptions where you have good food or bad food, controversial food or non-controversial food, and you see that in the markets. And we'll talk some about what Kohl's and Woolworths are doing to exploit that and what it means to you as we continue to go forward. I want to shift gears and talk a little bit about values and ethics in our science-based culture. Agriculture is very definitely steeped in science, and we should be, because we need good science, again, upon which to base these crucial decisions. But if we know values are what drives trust, can we better understand how we begin to engage in values-based communication? You're looking at that picture and you're probably thinking, I'll bet he was a male model. You would be wrong. That's Lawrence Kohlberg. He was a brilliant social psychologist at the University of Chicago in the 1960s. One of these guys who was just off the charts brilliant. Had his bachelor's degree by the time he was 18 and then just continued his studies. Dedicated his entire career to trying to figure out how people consider ethical or moral questions. When you're faced with an ethical or moral dilemma, how do you think about it? How do you begin to build a construct to make a decision? It's got 3 levels and 6 stages, and I want to use it to illustrate how sometimes we unintentionally undermine our own credibility simply by the language we use in our communication. So pre-conventional, direct impact on me, stage 1, punishment and obedience. I'm going to clean my room because if I don't, Mom's going to be mad at me. Second, personal rewards orientation. What's in it for me? I'm going to make all of my decisions based on what's in it for me. The conventional level, first stage, good boy, nice girl orientation. What will people think about me or say about me based on what I do? The law and order orientation, I will be in compliance. Compliance should be sufficient. Then you move to the post-conventional, principle-driven. You've got the first one, social contract, what's in the best interest of the group. And then finally, a commitment to universal ethical principles, things like compassion, responsibility, respect, fairness, and truth. Now, anyone in agriculture ever said, well, of course we take care of our land and animals because that's when we get the best return on our investment? Show of hands, anybody ever said that? Of course we do. What that implies is that the primary driver for all of our activities is the return on investment. We don't take care of the animals and the land because it's the right thing to do. We take care of it because that's when we make the most money. The implied message in that is if something else generates a higher ROI, we'll do that. So that message does not build trust in who we are and what we do. Or do we say, we're in compliance with all environmental laws and employment laws, regulations, leave us alone. Regulatory compliance should be sufficient. Or are we willing to say, as someone involved in the food system, I have an ethical obligation to my employees, to the animals, to the environment, to my customers, and to my community. And here's what I do to live up to that obligation every single day on my farm. Now, here's the really cool thing about this model. If you're a good farmer and you're doing the right things on your farm, it costs you nothing to move from the very bottom of Kohlberg's moral hierarchy to the very top. Reclaim the moral hierarchy. Reclaim the moral high ground. It belongs to you. Don't let the activists claim it. If you're doing the right things for the right reasons, then talk about it for that reason. Talk about your ethical commitment. Talk about your family heritage. Talk about the things that you do when it's unpleasant, when it's early in the morning, when it's late at night, to make sure your animals are well cared for. Sure, it also supports your bottom line, but you would not be involved in agriculture if your only concern was return on investment. You're involved in agriculture because of your passion to do what's right. So claim that and talk about it in that way. Help people understand that you recognize the obligation and you own it, and you're willing to own it and claim that going forward. The other challenge we have is that NGOs, activist groups or advocacy organizations, however you define them, whether it is the Red Cross or Animals Australia, the perception is they are driven by something other than self-interest. And that puts them at the very top of Kohlberg's moral hierarchy. Now, you can argue whether or not that's right, but it's reality. And in business, because we do have that profit motivation, we are perceived to be at the personal rewards orientation level. So when we come to the public discussion about who we are and what we do, and we're challenged by the advocacy groups or the activists, we have a significant credibility deficit that we have to overcome. Now again, is that right? Is it fair? Doesn't matter, it's real. So we have to deal with it. We have to figure out a better strategy. So if they come into the game with a home court advantage, that just means we have to be smarter and we have to play harder, because we can't just simply eliminate that home field advantage. So we've got to have better strategies and we've got to execute them better in order to help the public understand that we deserve to be at the very top of that moral hierarchy, so they can have trust in us and understand that we share their values, because values are the foundation for building that trust. So when we talk about a sustainable balance at CFI, we use the triangle for that because of its great structural integrity. And the foundation is making sure that our practices are ethically grounded, that we can communicate to people that we're committed to the values that are important to them, things like compassion, responsibility, respect, fairness, and truth. That our practices are scientifically verified, because we need that objective, measurable, repeatable data to prove the claims that we're making. And at the end of the day, if it's not economically viable, it's not truly sustainable. So never apologize for making a profit, but understand that economics and your economics aren't what drive public trust in who you are and what you do. Because historically, the questions that we get about agriculture today tend to be at the base of the triangle. Should you continue to be engaged in mulesing? Should you have that many lambs in a paddock? Should you be engaged in other kinds of practices in agriculture? And our historic response has been, well, science says we can. Can and should aren't the same question. Can is a question about our